is Interdisciplinary Perspectives. This will be taking place January 10th through 12th at the University of Southern California. Registration is open. The teaching or the speaking agenda is packed with thought-provoking speakers and eminent scientists exploring censorship in the sciences from all kinds of different angles. It's really going to be a great event, and so I hope you'll consider coming to USC or checking out the live streams of that event coming up next month. All right, so today I'm so pleased to be joined by several very active members of HxA who have been involved in STEM higher education up close and personal. Um, John Chisholm is a Silicon Valley serial entrepreneur and CEO and investor. He heads up John Chisholm Ventures, which is a startup advisory and investment firm, and he's been a trustee of the MIT Corporation, um, and was the co-founder of the MIT Free Speech Alliance. He's served on MIT visiting committees for mathematics, social sciences, linguistic and philosophy, and libraries, among many other accomplishments. And so we're proud to have John with us today with his background of involvement at MIT. Peter McCullough is an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Johns Hopkins University, where he's also the co-chair for our HxA campus community. Since 2002, he's been employed by the Space Telescope Science Institute and has discovered numerous extrasolar planets. And finally, Dr. Julia Schaletzky is the co-chair of the HxA Berkeley chapter and a faculty member in the biological sciences at the University of California-Berkeley, where she directs the Molecular Therapeutics Initiative. She's a biochemist. She's an expert in drug discovery. All three of our panelists today have amazing backgrounds. I'll encourage you to read even more about them. They also are closely involved in the questions we'll be talking about today, which is when it comes to the world of science, technology, engineering, and math, and the institutions that do research and do teaching in this area, where do the values of open inquiry and free speech and viewpoint diversity come into play? And what's the landscape right now for these values? It's well known that our roots at HxA were in the social sciences, but the stakes are very high when it comes to STEM. And we have heard more and more from members about how Heterodox Academy and the concerns that we have become very, very salient on the STEM side of campus or in institutions that are dedicated to STEM. All right, I'm not going to speak too much because we've got a lot to explore. I'll just be your moderator today. I'm Michael Regnier, the executive director at HxA. And my first question for our panelists is just about kind of how this issue looks from your vantage point. So at the institution where you are teaching or researching or involved, what have been some of the biggest setbacks and what have been, if any, some advances in free speech and open inquiry on campus at your institution? John, maybe I can start with you.
Sure, Michael. First of all, thanks so much to you and Heterodox Academy for having us and for hosting this. Free speech and expression is vital, critical to a STEM institution. We're engaged in a search for truth. The New York Times beautifully put it back in 2022 in a editorial board comment where they said freedom of speech and expression is vital to human beings' search for truth and knowledge about the world. A society that values freedom of speech can benefit from the full diversity of people and its ideas. So if anyone has been to MIT, they know that there are the names of great scientists over the last several centuries that are engraved on the walls of MIT. Every single one of those scientists was viewed as a crackpot or a heretic at some point in their life and career. I could give examples. Galileo was convicted of heresy by the Catholic Church. Newton purposely made the Principia unintelligible so that it couldn't be criticized. So what is true always seems clear in retrospect, but it's never clear in prospect. And any new truth is usually just from a small minority of folks whose views are generally rejected by the mainstream. And so if we don't allow them to be heard, we are holding back the advance of humanity. The biggest setback, in my view, at MIT in recent years for free speech and expression was the disinvitation of Professor Dorian Abbott from giving his Compton honorary lecture on geophysics. He is a noted geophysicist. He had written an article for Newsweek in the summer of 2021 criticizing diversity, equity, and inclusion, offering a alternative framework, which he called MFE, Merit, Fairness, and Equality. That led to his being disinvited from giving that honorary talk. I can't remember the last time the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal agreed on anything, but they both agreed that disinviting Professor Abbott was the wrong thing to do. And the brouhaha that resulted from that led to two good things happening on campus. One, the appointment of the Free Expression Working Group, which ultimately led to MIT adopting the Chicago principles for free speech and expression, or words comparable to those principles. And two, it led to the formation of the MIT Free Speech Alliance, which is a group of alumni, faculty, staff, students, and others, members of the MIT community, which today has some 1,200 members, mostly alumni, 700 or 70% are alumni. And they've been a force for promoting free speech as well. I could say more about the challenges and good things that have happened, but let me leave it there and let others share their experiences.
Thank you, John. So let's travel down the East Coast a bit. Peter, what's the view from Johns Hopkins?
Well, I thought about a couple examples, one positive and one negative. Let's start with the positive. At the last commencement, there was a protest, and it was handled very well. The officials were clearly prepared for protest, and they let it go on for a while, and it was disruptive, only in a loud sense, not physically disruptive. And then an official took a second microphone away from the speaker, got the speaker's attention, and said, "May I have a moment?" and acknowledged the protesters and their issue, and acknowledged that free speech was important, but this was a commencement ceremony, and would they please be quiet so people could enjoy it? And that is essentially what I think happened. So that was a nice success. I think a wonderful example of, good situation. One that was not as good happened on September 11th, by coincidence, I think. A speaker who I'm not familiar with, but I did Google, Mark Krikorian, was invited to give a talk at Hopkins by a student group, and word got out, as word will, that's how you get an audience. But protesters came and interrupted the speech, basically made it impossible to continue, and even set off stink bombs or something like that in the auditorium. Okay, that's bad. Maybe worse was that officials didn't squelch that heckler's veto. I guess one good thing about this was that our Heterodox Academy campus community hosted a debrief on that, because one of our members was one of the organizers of that event. And maybe characteristically, I was not aware of anything having happened. And so I learned about it, and I gave that person support. And it was very similar to the Stanford cancellation of, or shout down of Judge Duncan. And so I have a lot of material on that, and I gave that to the student. So the university, in fact, issued a prophylactic email to all staff and students about free speech, and that was very good, but I didn't actually read it because I sort of shrugged and went, okay, it's the beginning of the semester. This is good stuff to send around. I know what it's going to say. But it was actually in anticipation of this event. And so that's a black mark. And I think it just shows that we need to educate and to adjust culture to be more consistent with heterodox values, in particular, the constructive disagreement. I hope that that will work over time. I think as an extreme example, the CEO of that healthcare company getting gunned down in the streets of New York is, I don't think that's totally unrelated to society's separation into sort of two camps and the cultural lack of constructive disagreement.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
We'd like to think there's a role for universities to play in setting out a different sort of culture. Julia, Berkeley's historically the home of one kind of a free speech movement. What's your perspective about what have been advances and setbacks there?
Yeah, so thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to speak here from the perspective of a Berkeley faculty member. Berkeley has the advantage that we actually engaged intellectually quite a bit with free speech through our history. And we just had 50 years free speech movement. It was a big event on campus, also with Heterodox. We did a panel discussion between Edwin Chemerinsky and Nadine Strossen on the topic. So trying to educate more people. And we always get a lot of interest. People love free speech at Berkeley. And I think we have a long history of also tolerating dissenting views in the faculty, to a point that we're kind of known for this. I think what really did us in was the increasing politicization of everything interacting with free speech, because we are now probably, we are famously left-leaning campus. We're probably more left-leaning than we've ever been in our history if you look at the faculty composition. So this generates this thing where in principle everyone is for free speech and is also fighting for free speech and will hold up the value. But then if everyone thinks alike, it's very difficult if you want to question maybe a fundamental assumption for a certain policy that's favored by highly left-leaning people, progressives. So this makes the reality of it very difficult. And this is something we encounter a lot in heterodox meetings, which often our chapter meetings are a place where people finally can talk freely about the questions they have about certain assumptions, where we can explore data together and just share these concerns, because there is a lot of, I would say, self-censorship. It's not really institutionally from the top. Nobody prevents you from saying your opinion at all. But it is, if your whole department has one view and now the political belonging has become like a sign of your moral virtue, it's becoming very difficult on a psychological level to disagree with faculty members. And I think things have become politically so heated during the first Trump presidency, and then everyone who said anything questioning assumptions was immediately smeared as a right-winger. And this stuff can be pretty bad within the department, and many faculty want to avoid it because everything is consensus driven, the entire academic culture. And it's interesting because I worked in the private sector before, and John probably has some exposure to this as well. The academic culture is uniquely consensus driven. So I think it's all about the department agreeing with each other, everyone supporting each other's views. And so I think it's a bit at a tension between finding the right answer is the desire to find the answer that most people are comfortable with in this group. And this is something we see, and we try with Heterodox to support faculty members to be more confident speaking out, building a network, and also in that way being authentically themselves, because we have a campus value that we can bring our whole selves to work and be authentic. and this is highly valued in Berkeley, but at the same time, it's not true for all people. So we want to make sure everybody has a chance to say their opinion and engage, and then also have more discussion. I always found in science particularly, but actually in all fields, that the debate between people about assumptions and data is really where you learn what's true and where you can refine and mature your own opinion. And this is something I find very important, particularly for a university that's in the business of educating students, because I was just talking about faculty now, but I see also a strong discomfort among students to actually talk in a class about things that could be taken the wrong way or misinterpreted. The whole threat of cancel culture, everything is now forever in the internet. People very afraid of that. And so if I think back at my own student years and also, high school senior years, we would just actively discuss all kinds of political things, and any opinion, nobody had to hold back, and we would still be friends after that. I think it's kind of sad to see that go away. And I think faculty, we actively have to push back to make sure the university becomes a space again where disagreement is not only tolerated, but welcomed, and where we can allow students to learn more from each other by actually checking their own assumptions through the lens of someone who disagrees with that. So this is why I think it's important. This is also where we have issues, I think, everyone, not only Berkeley, to make that a reality, because everyone is so conformist now, and there is cancel culture and the threat of saying anything that could be filmed, whatever. Well, all these things play into that. But on the other hand, I have a lot of hope for the future. We have very positive changes happening. I would say more campus groups formed. So Heterodox Academy at Berkeley, co-chaired, by two former grad students from the psychology department, myself, I think has been instrumental. And we also have a Berkeley Initiative for Free Inquiry that has formed among the faculty and has been giving feedback to campus on things. We have also established committees on academic freedom and free speech in the Senate. But the leadership also really understands that we need to more actively welcome diverse opinions if we so much of a monolith ideologically, right? So our outgoing Chancellor Christ, really led in bringing a conservative speaker to campus for the first time in a long time, Condoleezza Rice, and debate with her in Zellerbach Hall in front of everyone. Of course, this event was disrupted by hecklers, but they went ahead and did it. And I think that was a great sign for the campus that we can't, we don't want to only be in our bubble talking to people who exactly think like us, but we want to make sure that we also talk to people of other political camps, other countries, other views, other cultures. All this is really what diversity means to me, also diversity of opinion and views.
Right.
So she set this up, and our new chancellor, Rich Lyons, also is a very strong proponent of listening to different sides of the story and allowing everyone to, respectfully make their point and engage in the discussion.
Great. So let me.
Julia, it's Peter. I wanted to respond to something you were saying. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I'm curious what your view of your campus culture is in the following sense. I notice at Hopkins, and other professors have confided in me that they notice it also, that there's less willingness by faculty to go and sort of break bread with students at mixer type events. I don't know about the student perspective, but I know I feel that risk that, you might say something that somebody will claim was awful, rather than just say it to your face and you go, oh, well, sorry, I didn't mean that. Let's talk about that. They go off and report you, and then you hear anonymously that you're in trouble somehow. And that fear it's there, and it's affecting the ability of students and faculty to, as I would call it, break bread together, which builds trust and serious relationships. I don't mean romantic relationships, I mean professional relationships. And it's a big problem. And I think it's possibly being underestimated, the importance of that.
I would agree with that 100%. I think it's definitely something that strikes many professors. The tone of conversation has really changed. When, it used to be fine to let down your guard, make some jokes, have a good rapport with people. Now everyone has to be like professional all the time. And that's, of course, it leads to a less human connection with people. I also see this between students who don't even want to talk to their peers or, have that kind of conversation or just be able to just be human beings. Everyone has to be professional front. Like, you can't say anything you couldn't be quoted on in a newspaper, right? And that really limits what you can express. And I think it's sad,
So let me ask, we've been doing a series of these webinars. We've talked to folks from community colleges, from women's colleges, from faith-based colleges. What is unique, do you think, if anything, about some of these sort of open inquiry issues as they relate to the STEM context, whether it's an all STEM institute like MIT or STEM-focused one, or just a biology department or an astronomy department? There was a time when some of the concerns that you all have mentioned were often dismissed by our STEM colleagues in academia because they would say, okay, that's a humanities, that's a social science thing. These are the hard sciences. We just follow the data over here. And I don't hear that as often now, which makes me think that some of these same concerns really apply, but do they apply differently? Maybe I can stick with you for just a moment, Julia. What is your take? Is this stuff hit different, as the kids say, on the STEM campus?
I think definitely, and there's two elements to this. The one major difference between humanities and STEM is that from an open inquiry perspective, the research we do requires funding, and typically large amounts of it. So I think where I see most censorship right now applied to faculty is through funding mechanisms. So, and this is both in the direction of not funding things you don't like politically, but it's also the direction of writing specialized requests for proposals to support your own political decision-making with some kind of pseudoscience. So I see both of these things happening, and it's because in contrast to, let's say, a historian who can write books, as long as library and everything is available, we need a lot of funding for lab work, for large studies, and so part of our job is also to fundraise. And this is where the self-censorship is originating often, because faculty feel if they speak up too aggressively, then they just won't be funded anymore. So we rely on this. So here STEM is very different. And I think the increasing politicization of the national funding agencies, which has been demonstrated by us, we wrote a paper about it with Anna Krylov and others, and now also topic of congressional investigation, I think is really unfortunate in that regard, because we definitely see a push. And this was earlier already visible in social sciences very strongly. I have a friend in social sciences who's been there for a long time as a professor, and he works on welfare and poverty. And he says, whenever he proposes a project talking about individual agency, it never gets funded. So he needs to propose it along the lines of structural determinants of poverty, and then it gets funded. But this is clearly, you can see how the government just drinks one kind of Kool-Aid, and everything has to kind of follow that and support that, otherwise funding will be withheld. So that's something. John, I think, has a comment.
Yeah, John, please go ahead.
I do think the self-censorship is a particularly intractable challenge, because there is a feedback loop between climate and behavior. And the more the climate doesn't welcome different views, the more reticent people are to express them. And that creates a climate where people are less likely to also express their views, and so on. So fixing this is really a marathon rather than a sprint, it seems to me. And there are two levers that we have. One is administration, and two is training. Let me call them those. What do I mean by that? There's no substitute for people talking to each other. if people can appeal to an administration to silence someone they don't agree to, then we never learn to live in a society where people disagree with us, where we never learn to crystallize our own thoughtful responses to criticism, and that we never learn to develop the strength of character that comes from having our ideas tested and challenged. So to be able to appeal to an administration, to law enforcement, whether it's the campus administration or outside, is just making civil society weaker and leading to a more authoritarian governance. And I think, to her credit, Sally Kornbluth at MIT, our relatively new president, she's been in place for just under 2 years, appreciates this and is reluctant to use top-down means to, or offer too many top-down tools, and instead is encouraging people to talk to each other with different views over lunch. The other angle or tool at our disposal is training. And it's a complement to free speech, and that is building self-confidence so you're not unduly offended by what other people are saying. And this is not just students, but should apply to an entire, in our case, the entire MIT community, developing self-confidence and avoiding the destructive self-perception of a victim. And so we can teach, or need to teach, techniques for building resilience, things like positive psychology, learned optimism, avoiding black and white thinking and friend-enemy mindsets. And we don't hear much about that. You know, what can individuals do to help create a more positive society other than holding back? Well, they can build their confidence and not be readily offended. And so that's a key part of this overall solution, it seems to me.
I have a structural suggestion that I wanted to get in here, and that is my employer, the Space Telescope Science Institute, and obviously I don't represent them in any way, but they came up with a good idea a number of years ago, and we have many years of experience now with it. We run panel reviews, peer reviews, in a dual anonymous way. So not only do you not know who's reviewing it, but the reviewers don't know who proposed it. And although this can't work in all circumstances, in many circumstances where peer review has traditionally been anonymous, in the sense that the reviewers know the names of the proposers, but not vice versa, when you make it dual anonymous, you tend to suppress or mitigate that concern, that self-censorship, that I, as particularly, say, an assistant professor, might not want to make waves, because I know that someday I'm going to get a 4 instead of a 5 on a panel review, and that's going to sink my funding, and it's not going to be based on anything other than my name, and somebody, like, maybe my name was Dorian Abbott, and somebody didn't like me because of something I wrote. So if Dorian submits a proposal that doesn't have his name on it, he can be more confident that it'll be given a fair shake.
That's interesting. And Peter, those are for funding proposals within the institution?
It's for time on the Hubble Space Telescope and the James Webb Space Telescope. And it wouldn't be, in my view, appropriate for like NSF funding of a 3-year research program at a university, where you sort of do need to know who's doing it. But in fact, those are being done also. I think I've been on panel reviews from NASA where we don't know who's proposing it. And there's puts and takes there, but I do want to point that out as a structural thing that can kind of break that feedback cycle of self-censorship.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities when we start to look at the structures we take for granted and question whether there's a different way to do them in support of this. We're about halfway through our time together, so I want to make sure that I turn to some questions from the Q&A box. I'll just encourage all of our participants to take advantage of that. Again, add your question or go ahead and upvote a question that you think is a good idea. One that's just come in, I think is worth noting. Could the panelists discuss the concept that free speech is necessary but insufficient to develop a body of facts? For the sciences, it's good that everyone can have the freedom to state ideas, but these ideas need to be criticized and tested to determine their value. Nonsense needs to be winnowed out from sense for science to function. And then he goes on to ask, at what point do we deem someone's free speech as useless for developing a body of knowledge? So whoever would like to start on that one, I think it's a common question that's important to get into.
I like that framework, or that free speech is necessary but not sufficient. It takes experiment and analysis and so forth to assess free speech, or the claim that's being made. So yeah, it's hard work.
My reaction is to think of Twitter, and it's not really an academic venue, of course. There are times when academics have used it. I find it repulsive and counterproductive and a waste and all that, and it's gotten worse. And a lot of that is due to the noise. So the signal to noise of the content of people expressing themselves has gone way down. In my limited experience, I'm not at all an expert on that. But that's the general idea, I think, here, is that if you let everybody talk, nobody can hear.
Right. Ask another question from the Q&A. And this is less about institutional governance than it is about the publishing side. So question comes from Camille. Do academic publishers' guidelines encourage self-censorship? I think in some circumstances we might all agree that they do, but what have you seen in the world of STEM field academic publishing? Julia, has this come up for you?
I mean, definitely, it's the similar thing as with the funding. It's a peer review, right? And typically the reviewers are anonymous and you are not. So it's the same thing. If people feel you are strongly opposed to some things, they hold like religious values, like strongly held ideological values, they will just find a way to spit in the soup. I mean, it has nothing to do with the quality of the paper. I think we're vulnerable to this, that despite our best efforts, science judging and proposal judging is not a purely meritocratic exercise, right? You can't really quantify everything about the process. And unless you have really strong discipline to just look at the science, what you know about that person will taint the review. I mean, there's really no question to that. And this is definitely problematic. Also, some journals actively embrace things that are non-science based, like I would say gender ideology was mentioned in the Q&A several times. That has infiltrated journals as well. Land acknowledgements, which are highly contentious. Then some journals propose that scientific formulas that are named after the scientists that discovered them are no longer named like that, because it emphasizes the contribution of white men too much. And it's stuff like that where you go like, what have they been smoking? But this is really now already from the top, part of publishing with us is you have to also agree to this, right? And I think this raises important questions. Some of my colleagues have fought battles along these lines. but it is very hard because you're the one who wants to get your paper published. So if you say, I don't agree, I don't want to click on a gender, or I don't want to, because I don't believe that even exists, or I don't want to put a land acknowledgement with my paper, and then the journal just says, well, then we won't publish you, right? So this is a real issue. I think it's compelled speech for the faculty. The majority of them just click on the box and move on, but people disagree with it. And I think this is not enough in the open, how much people disagree with it, because this is, to answer your earlier question, how is that different in STEM? I think part of it is also that STEM has, for a long time, and rightfully so, should be focusing on their science, right? My colleagues generally are not very political. I would say the best scientists generally not out in the open doing political activism all the time. We just want to do our work, be left alone, right? But this is also a problem then if journals come in and mandate things, or funding agencies come in and mandate things that you're not on board with. We don't really have a lot of organized pushback because everyone feels kind of powerless. And that was particularly aggravated through the pandemic and the social isolation. I think the departments are not as connected as they used to be. Also, to what Peter has said, the open conversation is somewhat limited with cancel culture. So it was harder to push back. And luckily, we have some really prestigious scientists who have achieved level in their careers where it doesn't matter, and they speak out because nobody can get back at them anymore. But it's particularly an issue for younger people who are establishing themselves because they take an outsized risk. But it's been shocking to me how, concepts that are completely non-scientific have now been mandated by both funding agencies and publishing houses in a way that really reminds me of creationism when that debate came up. But back then, nobody would mandate anything like this. Like the fact that biological sex is real, that is contentious, is unbelievable to me as a biologist. And I can't believe that we are now forced to acknowledge this in some settings in order to obtain funding or get published. And I've complained about it many times. I think, to me, ontologically, this is on the same level as creationism or flat earthers. And if I say something in a class that upsets a flat earther, if you're studying astronomy, I mean, I'm sorry, right? But this is something faculty in biological sciences run in all the time with students, particularly, who will complain because someone, and I kid you not, someone says something like, the frog is female. And a student will lift his hand and say, you have to say it's a frog with a uterus. So this actually happened. It's a real case. So this kind of stuff. And then the faculty don't know what to do because it's really scary. What can you do? The students are now unionized. There is a strong pushback. If you criticize anyone, the union will come at you. So all this stuff is playing together and making the campus really like, I don't know. If I had said something like this when I was a student, the faculty would have just corrected it and moved on. But this is no longer happening. So I think there were some questions in the Q&A about panel on sex realism, and all these elements, and that's definitely true. I think we need to push harder. Biologists at least haven't said that biological sex is mutable. I don't see any data to that, but we see a lot of psychologists, social workers, and other people that really have no business to talk about biology, make these statements, publish papers, and also publish books that get used in K through 12, and so on. So, and also the misleadingly named NSF, National Academy's consensus report on gender measurement, which is also an interesting term because I think you can't measure something that's not really there. It's really self-reported. So why do they call it measurement? So all these things play together. It's really coming from the top, and it has been a problem because it's coming from the top, and everyone is just forced into compliance.
So one thing John, go ahead. Go ahead, John.
Everyone here should avail themselves of the FIRE university rankings, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. They rank 250 colleges and universities around the U.S. on free speech and expression. Sadly, MIT fell from 136 to 164 out of 251 this past year. We're part of two groups broadly, the Ivy Plus on the one hand and STEM universities on the other. We tend to do well relative to the other Ivies, but poorly relative to the other STEM universities. We were the second from the bottom this time. I think a factor this time, and I talked with Wayne Stargart, the head of the MIT Free Speech Alliance, about this, was the Gaza-Israel protests on campus this last spring. The survey on which those rankings are based was done in the spring, right before and during those protests. And some of the protesters were engaged in free speech, as is their right, but others were engaged in intimidation and harassment. And that minority of protesters disrupted the campuses, and it took way too long for the matter to be addressed. And I think that was a factor that dropped us relative to other campuses and the Ivies overall. The protests were much more of a factor on the Ivy campuses than they were across the US overall. And so that's why we perform less poorly relative to other STEM universities, because they're scattered across the US and not all of them, or even most of them, would be considered Ivy Plus universities. I'd like to acknowledge some good things that, and so I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful as this fades into the past, MIT's climate and scores will improve. Specific things that Sally Kornbluth has done in the less than 2 years that she's been on board. Number one was a full-throated adoption of the Chicago principles from the Free Expression Working Group, which happened at the very outset of her term. Two, and these are things that other university campuses might do too, and their leadership. Two is initiated a dialogues across differences lecture series, purposely to get different viewpoints on campus. The inaugural speaker of that lecture series was Heterodox Academy's own President John Tomasi. Three, she was a featured speaker at an MIT Free Speech Alliance event in an all Ask Me Anything format. And four, very significantly, she eliminated the need for mandatory DEI statements for hiring faculty, saying that they don't work and saying that it was infringing on free speech. In fact, it's a form of compelled speech, which is the converse of censoring, and equally harmful. And most recently, she's appointed a committee on academic freedom and campus expression to figure out how the recommendations of the Free Expression Working Group could be implemented. So these are some of the good actions that have happened at MIT, and I maybe some of those would be applicable to other campuses as well.
Mm-hmm.
I have a few comments if I have time here. Is it
Go for
okay,
it.
Michael?
Yes.
Yeah. So one for Julia and one for John. Julia, I oftentimes, when subjected to a land acknowledgement at the beginning of something, I sort of sit there and go, are we still doing this? It seems so performative. And I haven't witnessed too many of them, to be honest, but I did want to push back and give an example where I thought, now that's kind of a good thing. At the end of each paper in the acknowledgements, for observations, astronomical observations that were made from the Mauna Kea observatories in Hawaii, they put a little sentence that says, we acknowledge that we're on the land of the, well, I can't remember the exact expression. And maybe about 10 or 15, maybe even 20 years ago, they started doing this largely as penance for having treated that situation very badly. And it had big effects. They still have had delays in building the world's largest observatory at the world's best location, Mauna Kea, because of the long-term bad feelings people have that they were not heard. And they're good, reasonable concerns. And they should have been heard, and that they were ignored caused a lot of trouble, still causes a lot of trouble. So that sort of acknowledgement has been a positive thing. And to John, I would say I love fire. I send fire money every month. Anytime there's a controversy, I pretty much can find a reasonable statement from fire. Sometimes I disagree with them. That's to be expected. But their rankings to the good are very transparent. They will provide you all the data and all the methodology and all that. But let's not get too worried about whether our university went up or down in their in their rankings, because they're largely about perception. They ask students what their perception is. And so that's a transmitter and a receiver, and you have to ask what's changed. So I don't worry too much about the rankings from Fire, just as I never worried too much about U.S. News and World Report rankings.
Peter, to your first point, I was heartbroken when MIT abandoned Columbus Day in favor of Indigenous Peoples Day, because Columbus is everything you could ask for in a scientist. Courageous, exploring parts of the world that had never been explored before, and a logical scientific mind that amassed lots of data of different types, like that indicated that the world was round when most people still thought it was flat. Now, there's no doubt that Columbus did many really bad things, and so did his men. But the fact is, so did the other cultures in the New World and elsewhere at that time. The problem with Columbus is they were documented, and they weren't documented with the other cultures. And so we hold them against Columbus today because of that.
I think one thing that I'm hearing is that some of the controversies and just political questions, not in a pejorative sense, but institutions are serving students, they're interacting with communities, they live lives in community, which means they do certain things that are symbolic. And even when you're talking about an observatory, or even when you're talking about MIT, some of those questions really are kind of inescapable, right? And these institutions have to debate those things and come out down on one side or another. So perhaps in that sense, our STEM institutions, are not as different as we might think. Peter, do you want to say one more quick word on this? And then I want to get to a couple more Q&A questions before we close.
No, that's fine. Thanks.
Okay.
I think you're fully right, though. It's a political point. I think the discussion I just witnessed, I think, is a great discussion. We should have more of that. The thing that gets me thinking is we don't have that discussion, because most people would be very afraid to even say Christopher Columbus may have had positive things, and we, this is the problem. So I think it would be really interesting to engage with historians, people who have really studied this, who have also a realistic view on what life was like at that time, for other people and so on. But that's not happening, right? It's just pushed from the top. This is what we're going to do now to virtue signal, and that's it. And I think this silences the debate, and that's exactly what we're trying to prevent with Heterodox and other groups on campus.
I don't mind an Indigenous Person's Day rather than a Columbus Day. I can go read to find out what Columbus did. I think a lot of people are aware. There are plenty of examples, like the Shockley limit. Okay, that was not a very good person, but did a very important thing. We need to separate the artist from the art. That is a pretty much basic idea that helps us live our lives without walking on eggshells.
Thank you. I think there are a couple of questions in the chat that have a common theme. John asks, can you describe ways in which you're helping incorporate civic discourse skills into STEM teaching, or I guess he's saying teacher education programs. And then we also got a question, how can students contribute to a better culture of free speech and resilience at a school? So I guess the common theme there is from a student's perspective, in terms of STEM education, are there some things that institutions should be thinking about doing in order to bring students into the work of building a healthy culture?
Absolutely. I would say at that opening week of introduction to university, first-year students should be given at least a few hours maybe on free speech and constructive disagreement. And I've long advocated that we ought to make, some videos, because that's how everybody gets this sort of popular stuff, instructing students on that. I think that ought to be part of the culture of universities, just as undoubtedly they have other aspects, the honor code or whatever, taught on the first week of first semester.
Yeah, I agree. I think critical thinking skills are really important. Very difficult to teach. It's not often taught, particularly not in the K through 12 system, not at all. It really got worse a lot in the last decade. I would say what I see is students with little knowledge entering the university and very little critical thinking skills, unless they have been at home exposed to that. And we need to sometimes work pretty hard to kind of get them to question assumptions. And understand when they're being manipulated. I try to build that into my classes at a couple of places where it makes sense. If we analyze, for example, visualizations that are provided by medical associations, and we analyze how they arrange things so it kind of proves their point, and so understanding data, looking at how you can represent data in different ways to support several views, all this. I think we're trying to build that into the curriculum, but it's a long game. And I would love if all students graduating from Berkeley had critical thinking skills and working on that, to make sure that they don't just read one article with one representation and then they become fully radical because they have never engaged with the other part of the story.
I know this sounds hopelessly old-fashioned, but I'd put in a plug for Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. He lays out principles in the book and in the course, which I was privileged to take back in my 20s, and it profoundly affected my trajectory. Look for and find the good in the circumstances around you and the people around you. Strive to find an area of agreement between you and the other person, no matter how small, and then try to build on that agreement. Have thick skin. Expect ingratitude. Don't be easily offended by points of view or criticism that are points of view that are different from your own. And don't criticize, condemn, or complain yourself. Steelman the other side's position. That is, come up with the very best argument you can for the other side's position before you criticize it. And then compare that with your own position and see if there's not something that you can gain. Very often, the people who disagree with us have similar objectives, but just different means. Okay, that's a potential area of agreement right there. By focusing on the means, then we can consider the costs, the benefits, and the unintended consequences of different approaches to achieve the same objectives. Those are some thoughts.
It's very well put, and with some echoes, I might say, of the HxA way, which is worth reading. We are working on refreshing some of our resource guides as well, because these are practical questions that a lot of our members ask about. As we're getting a little short on time, let me just say we got a question from our friend Bill in the chat. Hi, Bill. Who asked about, helping faculty gin up a little more courage to stand up and push back. I think part of that, as Julia mentioned, is getting together in person and on campus. Um, the the MIT Alliance and other local groups are certainly a big part of that. Where there is an HxA campus community, we'd love to have you join there, because part of this is not that we have to come together with other people who agree with us, but that coming together to realize that you're not alone if you see a cultural problem at your campus, and maybe we can work together and kind of have a little strength in numbers. There's certainly a little bit of what I'm hearing, I guess, is some positive trends. You all have talked about motion on your campus, some leaders starting to be more sympathetic, faculty coming together, but we also know that there's some deep, deep patterns you've been talking about that aren't going to be fixed overnight. Before we close today, I'd like to just make sure that for our audience, either watching on the recording or live here right now, folks know how to reach you panelists. So I want to ask, where can people find your work or link up to what you're doing? John, is there somewhere where people can follow you?
Sure. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. John D. Chisholm is usually my handle. But rather than follow me, follow the MIT Free Speech Alliance. The website is mitfreespeech.org.
Thank you so much. Julia, where can people follow your work other than, of course, seeing you at the upcoming conference at USC?
Yes, I just wanted to mention that another plug for the conference is going to be so awesome. I would join if you have time. I'll be on a panel, and I think we're going to talk about a lot of really, really interesting things. I'm putting my LinkedIn handle in the chat if anyone wants to reach out. And also another plug recommending our paper that we wrote with Anna Krylov and some others, Politicizing Science Funding. And this was way before. Now it's a bit more of a big issue, and politicians are involved in looking at it, which is probably a good thing. But back then, nobody really talked about this. So we were documenting, what's going on a bit across the agencies and what we were noticing as well. But yeah, I would love to connect, and thank you for Heterodox for providing this framework and the opportunity to connect with more people.
Absolutely. And Peter, is there somewhere where folks can find you? Oh, you're on mute.
Muted. Muted.
I was muted, sorry. I'm here at Johns Hopkins University. Google will probably turn up my email address. I warn people that I don't read every email, and I don't have any social media. I lurk there, but I never post.
Perhaps the sign of a wise man. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists, and thanks to all of you who joined us this afternoon. We are pleased to be doing this work, and again, please visit us at heterodoxacademy.org. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.